What if you discovered that your entire life was built on a lie? That the memories you hold, the stories your family told you, the place where you were born, all of that was just an edited version of the truth. When Margaret accepted the job as caretaker of an abandoned property in rural Vermont, she expected only two things: silence and solitude. Divorced, unemployed, and world-weary, that isolated house seemed like the perfect refuge to start over, far from everything and everyone. But what? She didn't expect what no one could expect was to find, hidden behind a false wall in the dusty basement, an old locked trunk with her own name engraved on the lid. Margaret Louise Hartford, her full name, handwritten, in childish handwriting. Margaret had never been to that property before, at least that's what she believed. But how to explain that trunk? How to explain the photographs inside, where a girl with her face smiled next to a woman she didn't recognize? How to explain the birth certificate that said she was born there, in that very house when her mother always swore that Margaret was born in a hospital in Boston? Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you realize something doesn't fit? That feeling that there's a missing piece in the puzzle of your own existence. That's exactly what Margaret felt. What she discovered inside that trunk not only changed everything she believed about herself, but also revealed a family secret kept for over 40 years. A secret buried in yellowed letters, faded photographs, and a truth as painful as it was liberating. Stay with me until the end, because this is the true story of how a lonely woman who thought she was just accepting a temporary job ended up discovering who she really was. And it all started with a simple job offer on an ordinary autumn morning. What you are about to discover may surprise you and perhaps even make you rethink your own story. Because sometimes the places we avoid the most are precisely those that hold the answers we need most. And before we continue this journey together, I need to ask you a sincere question. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever had that feeling that there's something about your own story that you don't know, that no one has told you? Or maybe you've discovered something about your past that has turned everything upside down. I know this subject affects us all because we all have our stories, our family secrets, those truths that only come to light when we least expect them. If this story is touching you in any way, leave a comment below about what has impacted you the most so far. Tell us, have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever discovered any hidden truths about your family? This exchange is what makes our community so special, because each comment here is a real story, a unique experience that can touch the heart of someone else going through the same thing. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take this opportunity to subscribe and activate the bell, because your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with real stories that move, transform, and make us reflect on our own lives. And of course, leave a like if you want to see more content like this, because it shows me that you value these stories as much as I value sharing them with you. Now, take a deep breath with me, because Margaret's story is only just beginning. What happened after she found that chest was even more surprising, and I need to tell you every detail of how this discovery led her on an emotional journey that changed not only what she knew about the past, but completely the course of her future. Margaret was 52 years old when everything began to fall apart. Not in the dramatic way you see in movies, but in that silent and devastating way that happens in real life. She had just lost her job as a secretary in Boston after almost 15 years at the same company. The dismissal letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, cold and bureaucratic, as if those years of dedication meant absolutely nothing. Divorced for 5 years without children, Margaret lived a grey and lonely routine. I would wake up, go to work, come home, watch television and sleep. The next day everything repeated itself. It was a life without colour, without purpose, without anything that made her feel truly alive. Do you know that moment when you look around and realize that everything you've built has simply vanished? That the people you thought would be there are no longer there? That the job that defined you no longer exists? That the version of yourself you knew no longer makes sense? That's exactly what Margaret felt, that cold Vermont autumn. She was lost, floating in an existence that no longer had meaning, and it was in this state of total vulnerability that she saw the online ad. It was simple, direct, almost minimalist. Caretaker for isolated rural property. Housing. Included minimal contact necessary. To anyone else that might seem strange, even frightening, but to Margaret it seemed exactly what she needed. Something inside her, a voice she hadn't heard in years, whispered that this was the fresh start she'd been waiting for. It wasn't just a job, it was an escape. It was a chance to disappear from the world that had rejected her and build something new, even if she didn't know exactly what. The property was 3 hours from Boston, lost on a dirt road, surrounded by dense, silent forests. The real estate agent, in a quick, impersonal call, explained that the house was over 100 years old and belonged to a family that had disappeared decades ago. Her job was simple: keep the place clean, safe, and organized until it was sold. Nothing more, nothing less. Margaret accepted without hesitation. She asked no questions. She didn't request references. She didn't want to know more about the missing family or the mysteries that property might hold. She wanted only one thing: distance. Distance from the painful memories, from the streets of Boston that reminded her of everything she had lost, from the people who looked at her with pity. She wanted peace. She wanted silence. She wanted to forget. But the truth is that some things in life don't want to be forgotten. Some hidden truths have a way of finding us, no matter how far we run. And Margaret was about to discover that this decision, which seemed so simple and so desperate, was actually the first step on a journey of transformation she could never have imagined. As she drove down the dusty road toward the property that first morning, her few bags in the back seat and her heart pounding with anxiety, Margaret had no idea she was going home. A home she didn't remember, a home that held secrets buried for decades, a home that had been waiting for her all this time. What Margaret found when she finally arrived at that property was only the beginning of something much bigger. When Margaret parked her old car in front of the Victorian mansion that cloudy afternoon, the first thing she felt was a shiver run down her spine. The property was exactly as she had imagined: imposing, old, marked by time. The paint on the exterior walls was peeling, revealing layers of color that told decades of history. The fogged windows seemed like blind eyes watching the empty road. The garden was completely overtaken by wild weeds, swallowing what must once have been neat flower beds and stone. Paths. Everything there screamed abandonment, oblivion, loneliness. It was the perfect setting for someone who wanted to disappear from the world. Or at least, that's what Margaret thought. She picked up her bags, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. The key the real estate agency had mailed was heavy, old, the kind you see in period films. When she turned it in the lock, the door opened with a long, dramatic creak, as if protesting being forgotten for so long. Margaret entered, slowly prepared to find dust, cobwebs, broken furniture, and the characteristic smell of abandoned places. But what she found was something completely different, something that made absolutely no sense. The house was strangely organized. It wasn't a recent organization, but it also didn't seem to have been abandoned for decades. The furniture was covered with white sheets that, despite being dusty, seemed to have been arranged with deliberate care, as if someone had prepared the place for a long absence, but with the intention of returning. The heavy curtains were closed, creating a twilight that gave the house an atmosphere of suspended time, as if time had simply stopped inside. And then Margaret felt something that left her completely disconcerted. There was a soft scent of lavender in the air. It wasn't strong, but it was unmistakable. It was fresh. It was recent, as if someone had cleaned that place just a few days ago. Margaret walked slowly down the main hallway, her footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. Each room she looked at brought more questions than answers. The kitchen had utensils neatly arranged in drawers. The living room had books lined up on shelves. There was an order in that chaos of abandonment that simply didn't match the narrative the real estate agent had told. And then, in the hallway leading to the stairs, Margaret stopped. Her heart began to beat faster. There, hanging on the wall, was a framed photograph. The frame was dark, intricately carved wood, clearly valuable. And the photo inside showed a family from the 80s, smiling in front of that same house. Margaret approached slowly, as if pulled by an invisible force. There was a tall man in a suit, a woman in a floral dress, and a little girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old standing between them. The family seemed happy, frozen in a moment of joy that the photograph had preserved forever. But it was when Margaret looked at the little girl that her world began to spin. The girl in the center of the image had her eyes. It wasn't a vague resemblance or an impression. It was exact. The shape, the color, the expression. And that wasn't all. The round face, the small nose, that characteristic crooked smile that Margaret always had and that bothered her in all her photos. Everything was there, in that child she had never seen in her life. She instinctively recoiled, taking a deep breath, trying to control the panic that was beginning to rise in her chest. "Coincidence," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling in the silence of the empty house. "It's just a coincidence. It has to be." But even as she spoke those words, a deep part of her, a part she didn't want to hear, whispered the truth. There are no such coincidences. There is no such thing as a chance resemblance. Something was happening there, something much bigger than she could comprehend at that moment. And if you're feeling that chill along with Margaret, if you're starting to piece together this impossible puzzle in your mind, then you've already understood the impact of this journey. Subscribe to the channel to continue discovering the behind the scenes of this incredible revelation, because this story is only beginning to reveal its deepest layers. Margaret picked up the photo from the wall with trembling hands, turning it over to see if there was any information on the back. And what she found there would change everything. In the following days, Margaret tried to keep herself busy. She explored every room in the house with almost obsessive meticulousness, cleaning, cataloguing furniture, noting what needed repair. It was a survival strategy, a way to keep her mind focused on something tangible, something that made sense. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, the photograph haunted her. She always returned to look at it, standing there in the hallway for minutes that seemed like hours, studying every detail of that impossible image. The girl's smile, the way she held the woman's hand, the happiness frozen in that moment. Margaret tried to find a rational explanation, something that would dissolve the knot of anxiety growing in her chest. But the more she looked, the less sense it all made. The hidden truth has a peculiar way of calling to us. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And it was precisely this whisper that led Margaret, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, to finally descend into the basement. It was the only place in the house she hadn't yet investigated, and there was a reason for that. Basements in old houses always carry a heavy energy, a feeling that things no one wants to see are kept down there. But that day, with the rain beating against the windows and the silence of the house pressing against her ears, Margaret decided it was time to confront whatever was waiting for her down there. The wooden staircase creaked with each step, as if alerting some invisible presence to her arrival. The air immediately grew, more humid and cold, heavy with that characteristic smell of earth and mildew that old basements have. A bare lamp swayed slowly from the ceiling, casting dancing shadows on the exposed brick walls. Margaret descended slowly, gripping the rickety handrail tightly, her breath forming small clouds in the icy air. The basement was larger than she had expected, filled with stacked boxes, covered furniture, and objects forgotten by time. But it was just as she was about to begin exploring that something caught her eye. One of the brick walls had a strange crack. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the result of decades of deterioration. It was calculated, deliberate. Margaret approached, running her fingers along the crack that formed an almost perfect rectangular pattern. Her heart began to race. She pushed hard against the wall, and to her utter astonishment, the entire section of brick gave way, revealing it to be fake. Behind it, hidden for decades, was a small, secret room. Margaret took her flashlight and illuminated the space. It was tiny, no bigger than a large cupboard, with rough stone walls and a compacted earth floor. And there, in the center of that forgotten hiding place, covered in thick layers of dust, was a dark wooden chest with an old rusty metal lock. She approached trembling, unsure if it was from the cold or the fear of what she might find. Each step felt like it weighed a ton. The transformation happening within her was palpable. Margaret was no longer the defeated woman who had arrived there days before. She was becoming a researcher of her own existence, an archaeologist digging in the ruins of a past she didn't know she had. She knelt before the chest, illuminated the lid with her flashlight, and felt as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. There, hand-engraved in the dark wood, in irregular but clearly legible childish letters, was written, Margaret Louise Hartford. Her name. Her full name. The name only her mother used when she was serious or when she wanted to show special affection. Margaret Louise Hartford. But wait, Hartford? Her last name was Wilson. It had always been Wilson. Her mother was Catherine Wilson. Her father, whom she barely knew, was Robert Wilson. So where did this Hartford come from? And how was it possible that her name, written in a child's handwriting, was engraved on a trunk hidden behind a false wall in the basement of a house she supposedly had never visited in her life? Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. Her hands trembled so much she could barely hold the flashlight. Her mind raced in circles trying to find an explanation, any explanation that would make sense of it. But there was none. Margaret reached out her trembling hand toward the rusty lock of the trunk, knowing that once she opened it, there would be no turning back. With trembling hands, Margaret forced the rusty lock. She had to use an old tool she found in the basement, prying the corroded metal until, finally, with a dry crack that echoed in the small secret room, the chest opened. The smell that came from inside was of old paper, mold, and something else indefinable, something like forgotten memories taking shape. Margaret lifted the lid completely and illuminated the interior with the flashlight. What she saw made her heart race. Inside the chest were piles of yellowed letters tied with frayed twine, old black and white photographs scattered haphazardly, a battered teddy bear that had clearly been much. Loved, carefully folded baby clothes, and there on top of everything, as if it had been waiting for her all this time, a birth certificate. Margaret picked up the document, her fingers trembling so much she could barely hold it. The paper had yellowed with age, but the typewritten information was still perfectly legible. She read it, reread it, and read it again, as if repeating the act could change what was written there. Child's name, Margaret Louise Hartford. Date of birth, March 14th, 1972. Place of birth, this property, Addison County, Vermont. Mother, Catherine Ann Hartford. Father, not informed. Margaret felt as if the ground had literally disappeared beneath her feet. She fell, sitting right there on the dusty basement floor, still clutching the birth certificate as if it were the only solid thing in a world that suddenly made no sense anymore. She had been born there, in that house, on that property that should have belonged to complete strangers. But how was that possible? Her whole life, the entire narrative she knew about her own existence, was completely different. Margaret had grown up in Boston. Her mother had always said she was born in Boston's municipal hospital on a rainy March night. She told the story every year on Margaret's birthday, about how difficult it was to get to the hospital in time, about how the doctor almost didn't make it. It was a story Margaret knew by heart. It was part of her identity. But now, holding that official document, she realized it had all been a carefully constructed lie. Her mother had never mentioned Vermont, never spoken about this house, about this secluded property surrounded by forests, never mentioned the name Hartford. Her mother's last name was Wilson, Catherine Wilson. At least that's what Margaret had always known, but there on that yellowed birth certificate, it was written Catherine Ann Hartford. It was her mother. It had to be. The date matched. Everything matched. Except for the whole story. That Margaret had lived believing to be true. She picked up the letters with still trembling hands and began to carefully open the envelopes. The paper was so fragile it threatened to fall apart at the touch. The first letters were from 1972, handwritten in an elegant but trembling script, as if writing under great emotional stress. As Margaret read, a completely different story began to unfold before her eyes. A terrifying story about control, fear, and survival. The letters were correspondence between her mother and a social worker named Helen Morrison. Catherine wrote about her forced isolation, about a controlling husband who kept her locked up on that property, monitoring her every move, every decision. She wrote about the birth of a daughter, about the fear that the girl would grow up in that toxic environment. There were letters describing thwarted escape attempts, broken promises, and a growing terror for the child's well-being. Margaret? That child was her. Those desperate words were about her, and the transformation that was happening inside Margaret at that moment was profound and irreversible. Each letter she read, each photograph she looked at, each piece of that impossible puzzle that fell into place, was completely reconstructing her understanding of who she was. The impact of this revelation was not just emotional, it was existential. If you're following every detail of this journey of discovery, if you're feeling the weight of these revelations along with Margaret, then subscribe to the channel now, because the behind the scenes of this story are even more intense than you can imagine. Margaret continued reading, and it was in a letter from 1974 that she found the decision that would change everything. Margaret couldn't climb up from the basement that night. She simply sat there on the cold concrete floor, the letters scattered around her like pieces of a macabre puzzle finally fitting together. She read every word, every line, every desperate plea her mother had written decades ago. The correspondence was between Catherine and Helen Morrison, the social worker who was apparently her mother's only link to the outside world during those terrible years. The letters were dated from 1972 to 1974, and together they told a story Margaret could never, in her worst nightmares, have imagined. The truth slowly emerged like a nightmare forming in the fog. Catherine Hartford, her mother, had been the wife of a wealthy and violent man named Richard Hartford. He owned several properties in Vermont and had political connections that made him virtually untouchable. When Catherine became pregnant with Margaret, something in him changed completely. He became obsessive, controlling in a way that went beyond normal jealousy. He completely isolated her from the world, turning that Victorian mansion into a luxurious prison. Catherine lived for years under constant surveillance, a prisoner in that house surrounded by miles of forest, without a phone, without a car, without any way to ask for help. The letters described how he controlled every meal she ate, every move she made, every second she spent with her young daughter. Margaret read with tears streaming down her face as her mother described the constant fear, the crushing loneliness, the terror that Margaret would grow up in that toxic environment and end up becoming a victim of the same control. Catherine wrote about how she feigned obedience while secretly planning an impossible escape. She described the behind the scenes of months of silent preparation, saving small amounts of money when she could, memorizing routes, waiting for the right opportunity. And then, in a letter dated January 1974, Catherine described the night everything changed. It was a brutal winter night, with snow falling heavily. Richard had traveled to Boston on business, leaving only a caretaker on the property. Catherine waited until dawn, wrapped her 2-year-old daughter in blankets, took only the essentials in a small backpack, and walked 3 kilometers through the snow to the main road, where the social worker was waiting for her with a car. That's how Catherine ran away with her daughter. And what she did after that showed a courage and determination that Margaret had never seen in her quiet, reserved mother. Catherine completely changed her name, from Hartford to Wilson. She moved states, crossing the border into Massachusetts. She erased every trace, every connection, every piece of evidence that Catherine Hartford and her daughter had ever existed. She built a new life from scratch in Boston, working as a cleaner in 3 different jobs, living in a tiny but safe apartment, raising Margaret alone with what little she had. And the most striking, the most painful thing for Margaret to understand now was that her mother pretended the past never existed. She never mentioned Vermont, never spoke about Richard, never revealed the truth about those early years. And Margaret never knew anything. She grew up thinking her life had begun in Boston, that her mother was a single woman who had always struggled to survive, that her father was simply someone who had abandoned the family. But now, holding those yellowed letters between her fingers, Margaret understood that each lie, each omission, each invented story was actually an act of love. Her mother wasn't hiding the truth out of shame or cowardice. She was protecting her daughter from a trauma that could destroy her. She was ensuring that Margaret could have a childhood that, if not happy, was at least safe and free from the terror Catherine had lived through. Margaret retrieved a photograph from the bottom of a trunk. The image showed her young mother, no more than 25 years old, standing in front of that same house. She was visibly frightened, her eyes wide, her body tense, and in her arms, a chubby baby with curious eyes. Margaret. That baby was her. And the house in the background, imposing and somber, was the same house where she sat now decades later. Her whole life had been a protective lie. Every story her mother told, every evasive answer to questions about the past, every change of subject when Margaret asked about the family, it all made sense now. But one question still haunted Margaret as she held the photograph with trembling hands. Why had she been called back to this house after all these years? When the sun finally rose, Margaret slowly climbed. Up from the basement, the letters clutched to her chest as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, her clothes were dusty, and she felt as if she had aged 10 years in a single night. She walked into the empty room, sat on the dusty wooden floor, and looked around with completely new eyes. Every room, every wall, every window had a different meaning now. This house wasn't just an abandoned property. This house had been her mother's prison. And it had also been Margaret's first home, even if she had no conscious memory of it. Every shadow in that place held stories of fear, but also of fierce love and unbreakable determination. Margaret wept. She wept in a way she hadn't wept since childhood, with deep sobs that came from the center of her chest. She wept for the mother who had literally sacrificed everything to protect her. Catherine had left behind any comfortable life she might have had, any financial security, any social connections, everything, just to ensure her daughter grew up free and safe. Margaret wept for the childhood she never knew, for the first 2 years of her life that were completely erased from her memory and her official history. She wept for the loneliness she had always felt throughout her life, that inexplicable feeling that something was missing, that there was a void she could never fill. Now she understood where that feeling came from. It was the erased memory of trauma, the silent echo of a hidden truth, the invisible weight of a past her conscious mind didn't remember, but that her body somehow had never forgotten. But even amidst all that overwhelming pain, something else bothered Margaret. A question that wouldn't go away. Why had she been called back to this house right now? It couldn't be a coincidence. The job offer that appeared exactly when she was most vulnerable, most desperate, most willing to accept anything that would get her out of Boston. The advertisement that seemed to have been written specifically for her, emphasizing isolation and minimal human contact, exactly what she thought she wanted. And that strange real estate agency that never answered her calls, that had sent the key by mail but never provided any direct contact information, no way to ask questions or clarify doubts. None of this made sense as mere coincidence. The next morning, with renewed determination, Margaret drove to the nearest town. It was a small rural community where everyone seemed to know everyone else, and she felt the curious glances of the locals as she parked in front of the town clerk's office. She entered the old building and asked to see the Hartford property records. The clerk, a grey-haired woman who had worked there for decades, looked at Margaret with a strange, almost recognizing expression before disappearing into the files. When she returned with a thick folder of documents, Margaret felt her heart race again. She opened the folder with trembling hands and began to read. And it was there, sitting at that stained wooden desk in the dusty clerk's office, that Margaret discovered the ultimate truth. The house had never been sold. It had never really been for sale. All that real estate theatre, the need for a caretaker, the supposed missing family, it was all an elaborate fiction. The last registered owner of the property was Margaret Louise Hartford. Yes, her. Her mother had left the property to her before she died 3 years ago, according to a will attached to the documents. Margaret read the words written in her mother's trembling handwriting in the last months of her life, explaining that the time had come for Margaret to know the truth, to confront the past, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But for some bureaucratic reason, some error in the system, the documentation had been lost, never properly processed, until a diligent lawyer finally found it and orchestrated that elaborate plan to bring Margaret back without completely scaring her. Her mother had not only protected her in the past, sacrificing her own safety and comfort to ensure her daughter's freedom, but she had also secured Margaret's future, leaving her the only thing of value Catherine still possessed. That property that held so much pain but also so much courage. It was as if Catherine was saying, even after death, that it was time for Margaret to stop running, to face the shadows, to transform that place of trauma into something new. And if you are feeling the impact of this revelation, the weight of this decision Catherine made, then subscribe to the channel now, because this journey of transformation is only reaching its most powerful point. Margaret left the notary's office holding the property deed, looking at the paper as if it were a map to a treasure she didn't know she was looking for. In the following months, something profound and fundamental changed in Margaret. She could have run away again, as she had done her whole life without even realizing it. She could have sold the property immediately, pocketed the money and returned to Boston or anywhere else where she could continue hiding from herself. But she didn't. For the first time in her life, Margaret made the conscious decision to stay, to face it, to transform it. She began to renovate the house, room by room, with her own hands. It wasn't just a physical renovation, it was an emotional reconstruction of everything that space represented. She painted the walls in bright, cheerful colors, replacing the oppressive darkness with shades that brought light and hope. She planted flowers in the abandoned garden, pulling out the weeds that had taken over and creating organized flower beds where roses, lavender and daisies began to bloom under her care. Margaret hung new curtains on the windows, finally allowing sunlight to enter those rooms that had been shrouded in darkness for decades. She sanded the wooden floors until they shone again, repaired the broken windows, and painted the exterior facade with a fresh coat of white paint that made the house seem reborn. Every hammer blow, every brushstroke, every plant planted was a deliberate act of transformation. She was literally converting that place of pain, control, and imprisonment into a home of healing, freedom, and new beginnings. And in the process, she was also rebuilding herself. The defeated and lonely woman who had arrived there months before no longer existed. In her place, someone stronger, more aware, more connected to her own story, and the impact that story could have on the world was emerging. Margaret finally understood, with a clarity that only comes after confronting our most painful truths, that her mother hadn't hidden the past out of shame or weakness. Catherine had done it out of love, out of a love so fierce and protective that it was willing to carry the weight of all those terrible secrets alone so that her daughter could grow up free from that burden. And by leaving that property to Margaret in her will, Catherine had given her daughter something far more valuable than a house or a piece of land. She had given Margaret a second chance, a chance to confront the shadows that had unconsciously haunted her entire life, a chance to honor the extraordinary courage her mother had shown by fleeing that winter night with a child in her arms, a chance to build something completely new upon the ruins of fear and trauma, and perhaps most surprisingly of all that deep, inexplicable loneliness that Margaret had felt throughout her life began to disappear. The more she worked on the house, the more she processed her story, the more she accepted all parts of who she was, including the parts she didn't consciously remember, the more she began to feel complete, whole, present. But Margaret didn't stop there. She realized that her story, however painful, had immense power. It was a story of survival, of courage, of maternal love that transcends any obstacle. And there were other women out there living their own versions of that story at that very moment. Margaret began organizing support groups for women victims of domestic violence in the region. She opened the doors of that house, which for so many years had been a place of forced isolation, and transformed it into a safe space where frightened and traumatized women could gather, share their stories, and find strength in each other. She used her own journey to inspire others, showing that it is possible to escape, it is possible to rebuild, it is possible to transform even the darkest places and experiences into something that brings light to the world. The abandoned house, that Victorian mansion that carried decades of pain, became a refuge. And Margaret, the lonely caretaker who had arrived there wanting only to disappear, became a guardian of hope. But there was still one last letter in the trunk that Margaret hadn't opened, a sealed letter with specific instructions that her mother had left. A year later, on a quiet spring afternoon, Margaret was organizing some of the objects she had kept from the trunk when she noticed something she had never seen before. At the bottom, hidden beneath the fabric lining covering the wooden base, was a small envelope. It was sealed with red wax, and on the front, written in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, was a single instruction: "Open when you are ready." Margaret held the envelope with hands that no longer trembled as before. Throughout that year of profound transformation, she had learned to face pain without letting it destroy her. She had developed a new mindset, one that understood that knowing the truth, however painful, is always better than living in ignorance. She sat in the garden she had created with her own hands, surrounded by the flowers that now bloomed vibrantly under the Vermont sun, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, the last her mother would ever write to her. Margaret began to read, and the words seemed to leap from the paper straight into her heart. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have found the truth. You found the trunk, read the letters, discovered who we really are and where we came from. And I imagine how much that must have hurt, how devastating it must have been to realize that everything you believed about your life was, in a way, a careful construction to protect you. Forgive me, my daughter, for hiding so much from you all these years. Every time you asked questions about our past, about the family, about where we came from, and I changed the subject or gave vague answers, my heart broke a little more. But I needed to protect you. I needed to ensure that you could grow up without the weight of that terror, without the shadows of that man haunting every moment of your childhood." The letter continued, and Catherine explained with brutal and moving honesty all the impossible decisions she had made. "I needed to protect not only the child you were, but also the brave, strong, and free girl I knew you would become. If you had grown up knowing the truth, carrying the weight of that past since you were little, perhaps you would never have become who you are. Perhaps fear would have defined you instead of strengthening you. And I couldn't let that happen. This house, Margaret, holds a lot of pain. I won't lie about that. Every room, every wall carries memories of terrible moments. But this house also holds something even more powerful. It holds strength. The strength that made me find courage on an impossible winter night and walk through the snow with you in my arms towards a freedom that seemed unattainable. The strength that kept us alive during all those years we lived hidden, always looking over our shoulders, always afraid of being found. The strength that built an entire life from scratch, without help, without a safety net, only with pure determination and unconditional love for you." And then Catherine wrote the words that would change everything for Margaret. "That strength is now yours, my daughter. It has always been yours, even when you didn't know it. It was in your blood, in your cells, in the way you faced every difficulty in life without ever giving up completely. Use that strength well. Don't waste it on fear or anger. Use it to build, to help, to transform. Live fully, Margaret. Live in a way I could never live, because I spent my whole life looking back, always afraid. But you don't have to do that. You know the truth now, and the truth, however painful, sets us free. And one more thing, the most important of all, know that you were never alone. I was always by your side, even when I couldn't explain why. And now, even though I am no longer physically present, my love continues with you, in this house, on this property, in this strength that passes from mother to daughter through the generations. With all my eternal love, forever yours." "Mom," Margaret folded the letter delicately, with an almost reverent care, as if she were holding the most precious thing in the world. And in a way, she was. She looked out the window of what was now truly her home, watching the garden bloom under the bright Vermont spring sun. The roses she had planted were in full bloom, the lavender swayed gently in the breeze, and butterflies danced among the flowers. And there, sitting in that garden she had created upon the ruins of fear, Margaret did. Something she hadn't done in so long she couldn't even remember the last time. She smiled. It wasn't a polite or forced smile. It was a genuine, deep smile that came from a place of true peace. For the first time in decades, perhaps for the first time in her entire life, Margaret truly smiled. If you've made it this far on this incredible journey, if you've felt every emotion, every revelation, every transformative moment along with Margaret, then subscribe to the channel now, because you are as much a part of this story as any of us. And it was at that moment, with that smile on her face and that letter folded against her heart, that Margaret finally understood the true meaning of legacy. And it was at that moment, with that smile on her face and that letter folded against her heart, that Margaret finally understood the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't about material inheritance or valuable possessions. It was about the transmission of strength, courage, and the ability to transform pain into purpose. Margaret's story teaches us something profoundly powerful that goes far beyond herself. It shows us that sometimes the places we fear most, those we avoid with all our might, are exactly where we find who we truly are. It is in those dark places, in those hidden truths, in those buried memories that we discover the most authentic essence of our existence. Margaret entered that house months ago as a caretaker forgotten by the world, a 52-year-old woman who believed her. Life was over, that she had nothing more to offer, that she was destined only to disappear silently. But she emerged from that process as someone completely different, as a woman who finally understood her own strength, recognized her own worth, and most importantly, embraced her own story with all its complexities and contradictions. Do you know what's most incredible about this whole journey? It's realizing that Margaret's transformation didn't happen because she found easy answers or because everything magically resolved itself. It happened because she had the courage to face the discomfort, to ask the difficult questions, to not run away when the truth began to emerge, however painful it might be. She could have locked that trunk in the basement and pretended she never found it. She could have sold the property and returned to Boston without ever knowing her own story. But she didn't do that. She chose the truth, even knowing that this choice would come with pain. And that decision, that fundamental change of mindset, is what allowed everything else to happen. And now I want to ask you, the viewer, a question directly. What truths do you still need to confront in your own life? What doors are you avoiding opening because you're afraid of what you might find behind them? What conversations are you postponing? What questions are you avoiding asking? What emotional places are you refusing to visit because they seem too frightening? Think about it honestly. We all have our hidden chests in the basement, our false walls that we build to protect ourselves, our official stories that we tell the world, while the truth remains buried somewhere deep within us. And the question isn't whether these truths exist, because they exist for all of us. The question is, will you have the courage to look for them? What past needs to be honored, acknowledged, and integrated so that your future can finally be free? Because that's what Margaret's story truly teaches us. We cannot build an authentic future on foundations of lies, even if they are well-intentioned lies, even if they are omissions made out of love. At some point, the truth needs to come to light. And when it does, we have two choices. We can run from it, or we can embrace it and let it transform us. Margaret chose transformation. She chose to honor her mother's sacrifice, not by hiding from it, but by using it as fuel to create something new and powerful. She took that house of pain and consciously, deliberately, brick by brick, rebuilt it into a sanctuary of hope. And the impact of that decision expanded far beyond herself. The women who now gather in that house, who find strength and community in the space Margaret created, are all beneficiaries of her courageous choice not to flee. Every life touched, every woman who finds the courage to leave an abusive situation, every child who grows up safe because their mother had the strength to leave, all of this is part of the legacy that began. with Catherine on that winter night and continues through Margaret today. This is how strength multiplies. This is how courage becomes contagious. This is how a personal story of trauma and overcoming transforms into a movement of collective healing. Margaret's journey shows us that it's never too late to discover who we truly are, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the truth, however difficult it may be to receive it. And that's why I keep telling these stories here, because I truly believe that each one carries a message that someone out there needs to hear right now. If you made it to the end of this video, if you stayed with me throughout this intense journey alongside Margaret, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." I read every comment, and I'm genuinely moved when I see that these stories are touching you in the same way they touch me. And if this content made sense to you, if it somehow resonated with something you're experiencing or needed to, here, leave a like below. It's not just for the algorithm, it's because this gesture shows me that it's worth continuing to bring real stories that move and transform. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take this opportunity to subscribe and activate the bell, because every week I bring you stories like this one that move us, that make us reflect, that remind us that we are all on this human journey trying to give meaning to our own lives. And look, there's a video right here that complements this topic very well, about how facing difficult truths can be the beginning of a completely new life. Click there and continue with me there, because this conversation is just beginning. A big hug, and until the next story.